Welcome, everybody. I'm Mike Smith. I'm president of Friends of the School of Mines Geology Museum, and this is the home stretch of what's been an incredible 2 days. How many of you were here last night for the lecture? Most. Okay. I'll try not to repeat any of my stories. But this whole thing, the condensed version of what I said last night. This whole thing started with an email of, would you like to come to Mines and give a talk? And it expanded beyond anybody's hope, certainly beyond my hope, and it became a case of altogether Dr. Hazen and 3 of his Carnegie postdocs and 2 doctoral students at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, all coming as a team, and it's been 2 days of immersion in technical workshops, seminars, panel discussions, our evening talks, and it's just been glorious. So anyway, let's see. As I mentioned last night, and this I will repeat, there were altogether, I think, 6 groups that came together to help defray travel costs and things like that, and also an early email that I sent to Dr. Hazen when he said he'd be interested in coming was, well, what would you expect in the way of an honorarium? And he said, well, can I bring some of my postdocs with me for workshops and things like that, which was just wonderfully generous on his part. But then, as I said, there were altogether 6 entities that have gone and rated their accounts to help defray the costs, and those are the Arthur Lakes Library, the School of Mines Geology Museum, Friends of the School of Mines Geology Museum, my organization, the Mines Department of Geology and Geological Engineering, DREGS, Denver Region Explorations Geologists Society, and the Colorado Scientific Society. And if you like this sort of thing, any of those organizations would be happy to have you as a member. And there's some membership forms for Friends of the Geology Museum on the table up here. And also, I told you last night about some very, very important papers that kind of started me off on taking an extended look at Dr. Hazen's research. And there's some copies up here of a little sheet with some web links to some of those papers and a few other things as well. So feel free to come up, grab a membership form, grab a links page and things like that, and have fun with them. Let's see. So I will, for those of you who weren't here last night, I'll tell you again a little bit about Dr. Hazen. He's senior staff scientist at the Carnegie Institution in DC in their geophysical lab, and he's Clarence Robinson Professor of Earth Science at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And he received a bachelor's and a master's from MIT, and the fun thing I throw in there is, while he was trying to figure out what he wanted to be when he grew up, when he was at MIT, he also studied at New England Conservatory of Music, and he was a very, very accomplished classical trumpet player. So anyway, got to keep career options open as much as possible. And let's see, he's the author of over 400 scientific articles, 25 books, including Genesis, A Scientific Quest for Life's Origin, and also The Story of Earth. And we had a wonderful book talk at the library today on story of the Earth. And by the way, over at the Geology Museum, Dr. Hazen was kind enough to sign a whole bunch of copies of that book, so you can get a signed copy over there at your convenience as long as they hold out. And also, he has, I think, at least 3 great courses, DVD sets, one on the origin of life, one on the story of the Earth, which kind of parallels this book, although it's the script for his DVD set under that same title is twice as long as the book, so he really expanded out in the DVD set. But he is also the 2016 Robley Medalist of the Mineralogical Society of America, and Executive Director of the Deep Carbon Observatory, which was a 10-year Alfred Sloan grant, and now involves a whole bunch of people around the world, and I think 2 more years to go on that grant, and very strong possibilities that funding will be extended from probably a variety of sources to continue that work. So let's see, and I think that's pretty much it. So take a deep breath, hang on, and please welcome Dr. Robert Hazen.
Thank you again, Mike. It's such a pleasure to be here. We've had an amazing 2 days of exploration and learning. I think the whole group has really benefited from this. And I'm pleased to sort of conclude these 2 days by sharing with you what I think is the single most exciting advance that I've seen in my career, something that's going to be hugely transformative to my own field of mineralogy, but also far beyond that. And that's something called network analysis as applied to Earth systems. All this work is carried out by an incredible group of early career scientists. We have data scientists at RPI, we have paleontologists at Harvard, we have geochemists at Johns Hopkins, we have a whole group of scientists at Carnegie and elsewhere. And in particular, once again, I want to call out the 5 of my colleagues who came with me and participated in the workshops and seminars and other presentations. That includes Simone Runyon, who's soon to be a faculty member at University of Wyoming in Laramie. She sort of led the group. Shauna Morrison, Chao Liu from Carnegie, Ahmed Alish, and Anirudh Prabhu from RPI. And most of the work I'm going to show you today was really spearheaded by their incredible insights and hard work, and I'm really delighted to be able to summarize some of the things that they did. Again, I'll encourage you to visit our website, dtdi.carnegiescience.edu, where many of the animations I'll show you tonight are interactive diagrams that you can, in fact, work with, you can study, you can get some of our source codes, everything we do is open access, and you can learn and explore as we do with these new ideas. So last night I told you about 3 applications of data, large and growing data sets in mineralogy and petrology and geochemistry and so forth, to science. We looked at mineral evolution, which is the change of mineralogy through deep time. We looked at mineral ecology, which is looking at the distribution, the distribution in space and time of minerals on Earth's surface. We also looked at something called affinity analysis or market basket analysis, which may be a way to predict. And tonight, I'm going to look at one last but really extraordinary way of thinking about the relationships among different geological objects, minerals, fossils, and so forth, network analysis. And we'll see how this works. Now, all of these diagrams, everything that we do, depends on large data resources. And so I want to really give a shout out to some of these data resources. The reason we do this is this exact same reason that anybody in earth science is involved in this. We want to understand the distribution of rocks and minerals, of fossils, of ore deposits. We're trying to understand how they formed and where they occur. Some of us are trying to understand planets and moons and the comparative aspects of those. We're certainly interested these days in understanding how life and rocks co-evolved over billions of years of Earth history, and that's a really dramatic story that's coming ever more closely into focus. So we do that, but everything we do depends on the incredibly hard work that's gone into building data resources. So we have rough.info/IMA. I described this yesterday. I told you how it was named after Mike Scott's cat, but that gave us $5 million to kind of work with and begin this. It lists all the mineral species. I'll remind you that a mineral species, which I'm going to be talking about tonight, is something that's naturally occurring. It has a very well-defined chemical composition and a well-defined structure. So when we say that there are 5,300 mineral species, we mean that there's 5,300 unique combinations of crystal structure, atomic structure, and composition. And that number is growing all the time. You can search this database by chemistry, by structure, by tectonic settings, by a whole variety of things. What we've been doing is adding to this evolution, as I showed you last night. And this is data in deep time. I'll come back to the mineral evolution theme because we can show this also graphically in new ways. So that's one mineral database. MinDat.org is another incredibly important one with over 300,000 localities and 1 million mineral locality pairs. It was begun by Johannsen Ralph on Christmas Day, and I think he said 1995 because he wanted to start making a catalog of his own personal mineral collection. He was a programmer, and he got very excited about this, and they said, well, let's get other collectors involved, and he started adding theirs. This was in the British Isles. And when the internet came along, he said, wow, this could be an international thing, and so he built it, and now it's crowdsourced, and it has its own board of directors, and it has its own funding streams. It's an amazing success story. I'm going to point this out because I know a number of you in this room have been involved in the last couple of days. And one of the really stunning conclusions that we came to, something that I don't think any of us really clearly recognized at the beginning of yesterday morning, was that what we have to do in economic geology is the same thing that John Ralph has done for mineralogy, the same thing that Kirsten Leonard has done for geochemistry and petrology, this incredible database, EarthChem. By the way, in case you are not familiar with what a rock is, it's just a collection of those minerals all joined together. And if I can be so bold here, just to remind you that an ore is simply a rock or a mineral it has one or more minerals that can be mined for profit. So you can make money on it, it's an ore. If not, it's just a rock. Macro stats, Shannon Peters. This is the stratigraphic columns from around the world. This was his baby, as was in very large extent PaleoBioDB, something that was crowdsourced now by the paleontology community. And even one that we use, and I'll show you later, is the protein data bank at Rutgers, a list of something like 100,000 protein crystal structures. Now, every one of these databases started from 0, and then 1 line, and then 10 lines, and then 100 and 1,000, and in some cases millions now. This is what economic geologists have to do. There has to be a global and international open access economic geology database. There is no way that you can advance the field of mineral exploration and discovery. There's no way you can understand the genesis of ore deposits in a deep and profound way without having your own data object. This has to be a passion amongst your community. This has to be a commitment. This has to be something that you start soon, you build it. Every one of the fields you should crowdsource this. You should all be part of it, and it's an incredible opportunity. Now is the time. Because as the data resources, the vast amount of data that's out there in publications, it just isn't easily accessible. So you need to do this too. We could not make the discoveries we've been making without these data resources. So what we're interested in, and what I want to talk about tonight, is the relationships amongst different objects, amongst fossils, amongst minerals, amongst rock types. When you can start seeing collections. So if you have a large number of different types or kinds, species as in minerals, then you can show them, you can illustrate them in various kinds of graphical ways. So we've been exploring this. This, for example, is a sunburst diagram. There's a vast amount of information because you click on any of these segments it's basically some taxa. It tells you for a given time period how many of each of these types of things, and you see the subdivisions. So the big band in the middle, the blue band, is arthropods, if I remember correctly, and so forth. And so you can basically represent information. Here's Ediacaran fossils in what's called a Chord diagram, where you see which species coexist with which other species. We can do this with all sorts of things. For example, ore minerals. These are all of Cobalt ore minerals. And what you see here is different minerals represented by line segments on the outside, and then bands showing which minerals most commonly coexist with other minerals. There's a vast amount of data in this kind of representation, and furthermore, there's a huge amount of metadata. I'm not going to be talking about these. This is just one kind of visualization, and there are dozens of them out there. But this is a very exciting approach. What we're going to talk about tonight are network diagrams, because they're particularly powerful in a way of visualizing simultaneously huge amounts of data that we have available now in resources, but you just simply can't get your mind around them reading tables of data. But you can visualize trends you couldn't see otherwise. So let's look at this. Let's see what this means. You've probably heard about social network analysis. This, for example, is the network of all of my colleagues who are doing network analysis. And the links show publications in some cases and just collaborations in other cases. Here's a more sinister one. This is the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. And one thing you notice immediately is that the structure of this network is somewhat different. There are a few central players that are highly connected. They're very centralized, and then there are many, many, many minor characters that only are connected to one individual. These terrorist networks are built simply to develop strategies on how to combat an organization. There are many other kind of networks we can talk about, but it's fascinating how this has been developed over the last 2 or 3 decades. This is old science. It's not been applied to mineralogy. So in August of this last year, Sean and Morrison et al. Published this paper on mineral network analysis. And it really created quite a stir. It was published in American Mineralogist, and several of the people on this you'll see in the first row are people who were here for this workshop today. The idea is simple. That you represent each mineral species as a dot or a circle. It's called a vertice or a node. If you have 2 minerals that coexist with each other, then you have what's called a link or an edge. And you take all the minerals that coexist with each other and you can make a network out of them. And so that's what we're going to be seeing. In every one of the diagrams I show you for the next little while, each of the circles represents a mineral species, and each link means that those 2 mineral species coexist in some deposit someplace on Earth's surface. So let's give an example. Here's a granite. You probably have a granite countertop or have seen granite polished in some building around here. And it consists of a number of coexisting minerals, all very common ones, all familiar. And those 4 coexisting minerals, and a few more that commonly occur in granite, then can be represented in tables and columns. So what we do is we go back to the literature, back from the 1920s and 1930s, when people actually used microscopes and looked down at thin sections and counted the number of mineral grains of each different type and published tables. Johannsen, 4 volumes, an incredible lifetime of work. He did 1,000 points. That's looking down a microscope, moving the slide and saying, okay, that's a quartz, that's a feldspar, one by one. And he did this for 5,000 rocks. That is an astonishing life's work. He published it in 4 volumes that are now almost completely forgotten. But they have a wealth of information because each of these columns is a set of coexisting minerals. And so you basically take this. I did this by hand. I went through the 4 volumes of Johannsen. I took characteristic rocks. I didn't do all 5,000. I did 729 of them. There are 51 different minerals. And so for each of these rows represents a rock from some locality. And it has a group of minerals. Those minerals have a 1. And the minerals that don't exist are blank or zeros. So it's a series of zeros and ones. And that represents this. And so you can take these kinds of data and you can make a network. This is the first network we produced. It was June of 2016. Ahmed was sitting with us at RPI, and some of you met Ahmed today. He's just an amazing guy, so much fun to work with. And what we did in this case, this was a very simple network. It was about 100 rocks in what's known as Harker's Petrology for Students. Now, some of you are probably smiling and nodding your head because when you took petrology, you probably used Harker's petrology for students. And it had roughly 37 different minerals and 100 rocks, and this is the representation. There are 37 circles or different minerals, and then they're linked to each other depending on what rock types. And so there's granite. And there's alluvium basalt, which doesn't overlap with granite because they're chemically quite different, but there's nepheline syenite, which does have some overlap. This diagram, just think about this. Simple diagram to make, one of the simplest networks we've done. All of Igneous petrology, which is an entire semester course in most schools, is represented by this one diagram. And there's much more I'll show you that's embedded in this. It may look like a simple two-dimensional diagram, but that would be a mistake to think that. Well, I'll show you why in a second. Here's another, this is a three-dimensional representation, this case of the Johannsen data I showed you. So there's now 51 different circles, 51 minerals that occur in different igneous rocks, crystalline rocks that you can polish and see the crystals. And so two minerals like quartz and topaz that are often closely associated will be close together in this diagram, whereas two minerals like quartz and nepheline that are never associated with each other will be far apart. And you can see this then as a three-dimensional rendering. You can rotate it, you can see various aspects. The thing I have to emphasize, though, is this is not a three-dimensional data set. This is a 50-dimensional data set. And the reason I say this, there's 51 minerals, and so you have each mineral associated with the other 50. And so this is just simply a projection, which is convenient, but there's much, much more data in the actual analytical data set than there is in this projection, which is a simplification. Nevertheless, even with a two-dimensional projection of what I just showed you, so we're just taking those 50 dimensions and projecting them down into two, there's all sorts of information. Let me show you what I mean. Bowen's reaction series. If you've taken a course in igneous petrology, you will remember that as you go from higher temperature to lower temperature, there's a sequence of minerals that appears. And the sequence can be defined in three trends: the plagioclase trend, the mafic trend, and the late stage trend. Those trends have to be present in this diagram. There's the plagioclase trend, there's the mafic trend, there's the late stage trend, there's Bowen's reaction series built into this diagram. Furthermore, that's a temperature axis. There's the high temperature and there's the low temperature, and this temperature is implied. We didn't use any temperature information in making this network. It's just similar or dissimilar minerals, and yet there's the trend. Petrologists also frequently represent the coexistence of minerals in what are called phase diagrams. Here's one, a classic one, in which you have the mineral anorthite at one end, quartz and forsterite. You see a coexistence which can be represented as a tiny little network of what coexists with each other and what doesn't. That has to be present topologically in the network diagram. The thing is, this network diagram doesn't just include these simple ternary diagrams. Any phase relationship you can imagine in 6, in 8, in 10 dimensions is present in this diagram. Things that no one has ever been able to study experimentally because it's just chemically too complex. Nature has been our laboratory. Nature tells us what minerals coexist. And we can therefore explore this in higher dimensional space using mathematics and extract the phase relationships. We think we can extract the thermochemical parameters for those of you who are into this. So actually, the things that lead to equilibrium of these systems, that's all embedded in these diagrams. So, our favorite kind of diagram, and the ones I'm going to show you from now on, are called force-directed graphs. I'm sure some of you looked at this and said, well, what are the axes? What is X? What is Y? What does that mean? Well, you have to get your mind around a slightly different way of thinking about this system. This is all relative positions of objects in this 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions. So imagine every mineral pair has an ideal distance between them based on how commonly they occur together or they don't occur together. So you can represent that as a spring, and the spring has an equilibrium setting. There it is. That's what you want. And each mineral that's connected to another mineral has another spring to every other mineral that is connected. And some will be longer springs and some will be shorter springs. And then you just let the whole thing go, and it tries to find, in this projection, the most stable state. So it kind of jiggles around for a while when you run the animations that you can look at online with and then eventually it will settle down to a state like this. So each of those nodes is kind of in an equilibrium position, which you could think of as the minimum energy position, but you could perturb it, as I'll show you. And there's a huge amount of information contained in this. Not only are these all 51 igneous rock-forming minerals, and every rock type that you can imagine is represented in here, but we have different parameters. The size of these circles, each one representing a mineral, tells you how common or rare it is. Big circles are common minerals. The spacing represents how commonly they occur together or they don't occur together. The color, in this case, is based on groups of minerals. So quartz and feldspar are in red. Just notice they're more in the bottom half. Feldspathoids are in the top, primarily, and so forth. And so you look at this diagram and you see all sorts of relationships that, if you're familiar with igneous minerals, you can start sorting out. So here's the kind of animation. You can go online and do this yourself. So this is just a little movie. That was quartz down there. Nepheline, which never occurs with quartz, is at the top of the diagram. Quartz is at the bottom. Now, connected to everything in this diagram is magnetite. That's an iron oxide, a very common accessory mineral in igneous rocks. So it turns out that one of the characteristics of this network, and there's biotite, which also happens to be present in conjunction with every other mineral in this diagram. So we can start thinking about what is the characteristic of this network? What makes this special? This is a very compact or a dense network. We'll see other networks that have very low density. That's a parameter we can measure. This also has a very low diameter. It is, you've heard of 6 degrees of separation. How everybody is connected? Well, in this, there's only 2 degrees of separation. Everything's connected through magnetite and hematite. So from any node, you can get to any other node in only 2 jumps. But we'll see other networks where the separation is much greater. And these turn out to be incredibly important characteristics that tell us something about the nature of the minerals and the systems that you simply could not get by looking at tables of data. I don't care how good a mineralogist you are. I don't care how many years you stare at tables of data. You cannot keep in your mind hundreds of data simultaneously. Let's see how we can use this. Here's one really fun example that Shauna Morrison has been working on. She's been thinking about comparing different planets and moons. So here we have Earth, we have our moon, Vesta, which is an asteroid that sends us HED-type meteorites. So we have information on that, and there's Mars. And you can do the networks for each of these, and you can compare and contrast them. And there actually are some significant differences. In particular, Earth stands out. We think that the network characteristics of Earth may represent a biosignature, simply because biology has such a profound effect on Earth, unlike these other worlds. I'm not going to go to the details of this, but this is a hypothesis that we're testing and exploring that's really exciting. Let's look at Morrison's work on copper minerals. Here are the 243 most common copper minerals. We're seeing all of them at the same time in a network, and she's actually done the network for all 600 plus minerals. That gets even more complicated. But there's a vast amount of information in here. Again, the size of the nodes has to do with how common the mineral is. And in this case, the color has to do with composition. So in copper minerals, the role of sulfur and oxygen is very important. So we see that we have in red at the top, those are sulfide minerals with sulfur but no oxygen. We see in blue at the bottom left, oxides, carbonates, phosphates, other things with oxygen but no sulfur. In orange are the sulfates that have both sulfur and oxygen. And look at how strong the segregation is by color. That's not true for every mineral group, by the way, but for copper minerals, it turns out that sulfates love to be with sulfides, sulfides want to be with sulfides, and the oxides want to be with the oxides. And we'll see that copper is an interesting example. So there's the sulfide minerals like chalcopyrite. There's the oxide carbonates and so forth, like azurite, my favorite mineral. There's the sulfates like brochantite. And it's really remarkable to me, that degree of segregation. So you can do things called cluster analysis and other kinds of analysis to see how these different nodes, these different minerals segregate themselves into subgroups. A huge amount that can be done. Something else we can, of course, manipulate this. There's chalcopyrite, the most abundant and associated with almost every other copper mineral. I think the diameter of this network is 3. So almost everything goes through chalcopyrite. There's malachite, which is also very, very abundant. You notice malachite's down on the blue side. And even though we can disrupt this network, when it goes back together, it pretty much still forms clusters with red blue, and yellow. But look at copper. Now this was a surprise to me. Copper really is very strongly associated with the lower half of the diagram, not to the sulfides. Now I'm not an ore geologist, so I don't think about copper minerals this way, but this was a real surprise to me. I thought copper, native copper, must go with the sulfides because it's more reduced, but that's totally wrong. And people who know ore geologists tell me, oh no, that's wrong. But if you're an ore geologist, if you're interested in copper mineralogy, I guarantee you there are hundreds of surprises in this diagram because you can see every copper mineral, you can see every association of every copper mineral with every other copper mineral. We can make this diagram to include uranium minerals and lead minerals and other minerals. You could actually make a network with all 5,300 minerals. And then you could have filters, say, now let me just see the uranium minerals, now let me just see the lead minerals, and so forth. These are all techniques that can be used with this kind of data. And it's amazing things to discover. So you can see this is a less dense network. Here's one, I just love this. This is Chaliu's data on chromium minerals. So roughly 60 chromium minerals. There are fewer of them. And you notice that one giant circle in the middle, that's chromite. More than half of all known chromium mineral locality pairs are that one mineral chromite, which kind of dominates everything. What he's done here is, you see this high diameter. It's like, I think the diameter is 7 on this. So to get from one end of this diagram to the other, you have to go through a lot of steps. The coloring here now is based on something even different from what I've shown you. This is what are called the mode of formation, or what we say the paragenetic mode. And so in orange are igneous, intrusive minerals. In green are weathering products. The one in tan that go up to the top are what are called chromate, or very oxidized minerals that occur in desert soils, and so forth. And there are other sorts of things. So those are also very segregated, not surprisingly by the different places on Earth where you find the minerals. This one's really fun to play with. I urge you to go online and try this, because chromite is so dominant that it just makes the whole network go crazy. And I have to confess, yes, this is fun. We're learning serious things, but we just have fun with it. And sometimes you just wiggle things, and it's fascinating. But notice how the green down here, that's crocoite, that's one of the weathering products, and they really sort of are isolated from the others. So this is pretty interesting. This is chromium minerals, and we can do this with every mineral group. We can do this in other ways. Anirudh Prabhu was interested in the evolution of cobalt minerals through Earth history. So, for those of you who weren't here last night, here's this kind of review of oxygen plotted on this blue line to Earth history. 4.5 billion years ago, oxygen was extremely low. Essentially no molecular oxygen in the atmosphere. And for a long period of time that was true. About 2.5 billion years ago, photosynthesis caused a rise of oxygen, and the first molecular oxygen occurred in the atmosphere. And then maybe 700 million years ago, there was another pulse, another rise up to more or less modern levels. And obviously this atmospheric change has an influence on mineralogy as well. So Anirudh wanted to see how this might be done. So you can do this with a series of network diagrams. So there's before the Great Oxidation Event, there's after the Great Oxidation Event. Here you see two kinds of nodes. In blue are the cobalt minerals. In orange are the elements that are contained in those minerals. So we're actually seeing additional kinds of information in these networks. So I can show you this as separate snapshots, or we can see an animation. I'll show you one of those later on. This is one of my favorite networks. This is Dan Hummer's work. Dan Hummer was a postdoc with me. He now has the mineralogy position at Southern Illinois University. And Dan decided he wanted to study manganese minerals. There are over 400 manganese minerals that are shown in this diagram. In this network, he colored the manganese minerals, in this case, by their oxidation state. You have more reduced types of manganese minerals. In red here, the 2+. You have more oxidized ones in the 3+ and the 4+. And what you'll see here very strikingly is that there's like little nubs off to the side. That nub at the top, it turns out those are manganese phosphate minerals that occur in what are called pegmatites. And they sort of never occur with other manganese minerals. They're their own little world. And there's that second nub off to the side. Those are manganese metamorphic minerals, also predominantly red, reduced, divalent sorts of materials. That hairball in the middle with hundreds and hundreds of manganese minerals, that has more of the 3+ and the 4+ or oxidized phases. And if you've been in the field and you've seen the black manganese coatings, desert varnish, that sort of thing, that's what we're talking about here in the distribution. One of the wonderful things about these diagrams, this is a three-dimensional diagram. Oh yeah, there's the 4+. You can actually render this in 3 dimensions. And you can rotate it. You can put on virtual reality glasses. You can walk into this network. You can grab onto the nodes and find out what they are. You can move them with your hand to see how they're connected. It's actually a very disorienting experience. And you can see there for its cryptomelane, that's one mineral that's very central to all 3 groups, so it has that very prominent position. And you can go through this and look at other sorts of aspects and rotate around and zoom in and zoom out. Now, I can't even begin to comprehend the information in here. I don't know the manganese minerals that well, but people who really know manganese minerals can learn an extraordinary amount from this. And furthermore, every one of those nodes has metadata, like the localities where they occur, like the other minerals that coexist besides the manganese mineral. Any other information you want, it's in the databases we now have. So you could explore this for weeks and not run out of things to learn. Okay, so that's just simple diagrams with a single kind of node. Even more information can be packed into what are called bipartite networks, where you have 2 different kinds of nodes. And they're most familiar in everyday sort of reading to the spread of diseases. For example, the black nodes in here may be airports, or they might be hospitals, transportation hubs of some sort. The other nodes, the colored ones, are men and women who have gotten that viral disease, and then you see the way it's transferred out from some primary source and gets radiated out to other places. This kind of spread of things from one location to another can be easily represented by these bipartite diagrams. And we said, okay, well, we can do that with minerals. We have localities, we have minerals. Let's see how minerals are related to their localities. And the result was a shock. A shock that we still don't fully comprehend, and it has thrown people in the network analysis world into a tizzy because they've never seen anything like it. Here is the network for carbon minerals. What you're seeing here now in colors are the minerals of carbon. In this particular case, the size and the color both indicate how common they are. So big red circles are common minerals like calcite. As you get smaller and smaller, you see the gradient of color going from the reds to the cooler blues and greens on the outside. Those are the very rare minerals. There's a U of localities. The localities are in black. The smaller localities are connected to only 1 or 2 carbon-bearing minerals. The larger circles that you see at the top are connected to many different carbon minerals. And the astonishing thing that you just can't help notice right away is this has a symmetry to it. It has this beautiful U shape. And I think of this as a flowering of the minerals of carbon into this great bouquet of this incredible diversity of these rare minerals. What you're seeing here, if you were here last night, I talked about large number of rare event distribution. This is a visual representation of a large number of rare event distribution. And the amount of information here is mind-boggling because we have over 400 localities and we have 400 different carbon minerals. And you're seeing the interrelationship of all that information, but the fact that there's a symmetry. And this is not like that viral disease spread that just sort of a spaghetti diagram or network. There's some fundamental parameter here about the distribution of minerals on Earth, and you don't see this on the Moon, and you don't see this on Mars. This is a geometry that seems to be a characteristic of Earth, and the metaphor of a blossoming, to me, also symbolizes the coevolution of the geosphere and the biosphere in a very powerful way. So what are we looking at here? There's calcite, that's a common mineral. There's witherite, it's a barium carbonate, somewhat rare, but not really rare. But then there are all these incredibly rare things. Cozoite with lanthanum is known from one locality. We can also look at the localities. And the 2 most abundant localities are the Kola Peninsula in Russia. And if I can point this out, there is a group of about 20 minerals that are only known. They're carbon-bearing minerals that are only known from this locality. We also have the La Poudrette Quarry, a famous locality in Quebec, Canada. And again, there are about 20 minerals that are only known from La Poudre quarry. And then there's this really cool group of 7 minerals that are known only from these 2 localities. And it gives you this symmetry down. It's just, to me, this is mind-boggling. This is a symmetry buried in nature in this kind of abstract representation that's telling us something. And we want to know what it means. And we've seen this before. Now, we can interrogate this in other ways. We can say, well, what's the 3-dimensional representation? And there it is. In this case, the localities are in gray. And again, you can put on your virtual reality glasses and you can walk into this and you can walk inside what is sort of like a polyp-shaped thing. And inside the polyp are the common minerals and outside are the rare minerals. I mean, it leaves me speechless when I look at this. I still think this is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And anyway, that's exciting. So, here's something else. This was just a couple of weeks ago. This is the work that Simone Runyon did. We had a group come from Notre Dame, experts in uranium minerals, and they said, we want to understand uranium ore deposits. And we said, okay, well, what can you tell us? He said, well, uranium ore deposits fall into this classic group, about 13 different types listed here. We have examples of most of these. We can tell you what minerals occurred. So we said, let's do a bipartite diagram. In this case, this is getting pretty abstract. Each node is a deposit type. You know, so one node will be sandstone roll front, and another node will be coal. And then let's see what uranium minerals are linked to each of those deposit types. Remember what I said about symmetry? I mean, is this breathtaking to you? It is to me. We basically had data in this case for 11 different deposit types. And so you thought there'd be 11 nodes and they'd be scattered all over everywhere and the minerals would be all over here and it'd just be a random mix. And what we see is this incredible symmetry again. In this case, threefold symmetry, because it looks like to us that there's 3 clustering of these deposit types. And at least from a mineralogical perspective, there's really 3 very large-scale types of uranium deposits. And then there's a lot of additional details, and I can't get into that. This is really Simone's work, and she's exploring this. And this, you see, is a very crude diagram. We haven't really colored the mineral nodes in any interesting way. They're just green. The localities are black. But what you see is there's a central group of minerals that are common to all 3 of those deposit cluster types. There's also sets of 3 nodes that are common to 2 of the 3, but far away from the 3rd because they don't occur there. And then there's these 3 really nice arcs of minerals that are only part of 1 of the 3 clusters. Am I making that sort of clear? I mean, the symmetry comes out of the fact that you have minerals being segregated in 3 different ways. And you look at this and say, why? Well, we've looked at this. We can get a little bit of a sense. Those 2 are polymetallic vein deposits and hydrothermal deposits. And there are a whole bunch of those unique minerals up there that are uranium with semimetals like antimony. These down here include coal. They include the roll front deposit, which are associated with organic carbon, and you get an oxidation reduction. And a lot of vanadium uranium minerals are found down in this unique set. And there's actually a couple of mines, I think they're in Colorado, where people are sort of passionately finding new minerals. So that's why there may be a lot of bumps down there. And then there's this group, which includes uranium phosphates. That includes granite pegmatites, where there's a lot of phosphates, and also phosphorites, where there's a lot of phosphates. So that's kind of understandable. But there's so much more to this, and this doesn't even begin to explore the ways that these nodes are linked to other things, lead minerals and you know, arsenic minerals and sulfur minerals and so forth. So you could add so much more information, and anybody who knows about uranium deposits is probably already seeing much more on this than I do. But this is just the beginning of an incredibly exciting exploration that could be applied to any metal or other type of ore. It can be applied to petroleum, where you have different petroleum types, and those dots are organic molecules, like the species that occur in abundance in a petroleum. This could be applied in so many ways. So this is a very exciting direction. But still, having said that, I hope many of you have been questioning at this point, wow, what a gimmick. You know, it's clever, it's pretty pictures, you know, but Is this science? Is there anything here? Is this going to lead us to discoveries of any sort, or is this just a kind of fun way of representing data that's kind of abstract, and maybe you can make wallpaper out of it, or greeting cards? And I would argue that the reason this is much more than that, just pretty pictures, is because of something that I've only alluded to so far. But networks embed information that you don't use when you build the networks. They reveal relationships that you simply aren't including. The only thing you include when you make these networks is whether two things coexist or not. A locality and a mineral coexist, or a mineral coexists with another mineral. That's the only information we use. There's no age information, there's no composition information, there's no time or temperature, or anything else. However, when you make these networks, they give information. Let's go back to Shauna's copper diagram. Remember that we had sulfides, we had oxides, we had sulfates. What that means is that embedded in this diagram are what are called activity axes. There's the activity of oxygen increasing from very low oxygen activity to very high oxygen activity, compositionally through this network. And remember, this is a much higher dimensional state, so that when you go in detail, there'll be much more nuances to an axis like this. But you can see the general axis. There's the sulfur activity going from low sulfur activity to high sulfur activity. Again, embedded in the network. It has to be, if you think about it, because minerals that form at very low oxygen activity will be together, coexist. Minerals that form at high oxygen fugacity will be together, and they're going to be far apart. And so that's what a network is going to do for you. It's going to show you relationships that you may not have suspected. In this case, it's pretty obvious, but in some cases, it's not. Here's a different diagram altogether. These are trilobites. As I alluded to last night, I am a passionate fan of trilobites. I've collected them all over the world. I had a big collection I gave to the Smithsonian recently. Go to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, you'll see some really cool trilobite specimens. Well, trilobites come in all different sizes and shapes and varieties and so forth, and they evolve through time. So here is a network diagram that just shows coexisting genera of trilobites, and they're colored by the different orders of trilobites. And anybody who knows trilobites sees an evolutionary pattern here. The earliest ones are these ulanellids that occur in the lower Cambrian, middle Cambrian. There's some great localities in Nevada and California. A day's drive from here. There's the Tychoperas. They're everywhere, very, very common in the Cambrian and into the Ordovician. The Asaphids, also very common, but more so in the Ordovician. There's the Phacopids, the Lycids, and then at the tail end, when things almost went completely extinct and sort of hung on for a little while, at the end are the Proetids. Anyone who's a trilobite collector or a paleontologist looks at sees that there's an axis of time in here. This is an evolutionary sequence. There was no time information whatsoever included in making this diagram, and yet the time axis has to be there. It's an evolving system. Things that occurred early in that evolution are not going to coexist with things that occurred late in that sequence, so you have to have the axis. And we'll see in a second, even though we know the time axis in some situations, in some cases we can discover a time axis. Let me show you this in a different way. The same information, though, drawn as a sequence of snapshots at 1 million year intervals. So this is an animation. You can't see it up at the top. It says 521, 19, 18, 17. And you're seeing the trilobite genera, and you'll see it's very stable for a while, and then suddenly, oops, there was a mass extinction. A lot of things went out, new things coming in. It's pretty stable, but wait for it. And you're going to see a sudden jump. The green is almost completely extinct. The dark blue is becoming more prominent. It's kind of, things are experimenting. Oops, there's a new group, and there's a mass extinction again. And things are just disappearing like mad now, and now we're down only to the dark blue Proetids towards the end of the Carboniferous and into the Permian. That's the entire evolution of trilobites you're seeing there. And the data that you can look at paleontological lists till you're blue in the face. You've never seen trilobite evolution like this before. This tells you things you couldn't know. We can do this for so many different systems. Another thing that they've done, there's Drew down at the bottom, Mike Meyer, who's now at Pennsylvania and Anaru. They worked on the Ediacaran. The Ediacaran is a very fascinating time in Earth history. This is the first appearance of multicellular life. It was roughly 570 or so million years ago. This is before that thing I call the Cambrian explosion from the previous graph you saw. And you can find these kind of jellyfish-like or frond-like or weird, people aren't really sure what they are. You can find these fossils around the world. There's a whole bunch of interesting forms. So they're very enigmatic. They occur sparsely. They're not preserved in nearly the kind of detail that things are preserved from the last few hundred million years, because they weren't mineralized in the same ways. But here is this kind of stratigraphic section of the Ediacaran, and people have divided the Ediacaran into three distinct faunal types. The earliest one's called the Avalonian, was 575 to 560. And people have suggested it's kind of an offshore, deep water kind of environment. Then the White Sea, which is 560 to 550, that looked like a shallower. And then the Nama seemed like it might be intermediate, and that's from 550 to 543. So these are three fairly well documented. And what Drew and Mike did is they put together a database of every known Ediacaran fauna, every known Ediacaran locality. And there's roughly 100 genera from 100 localities, that sort of order. So it's not a huge database, but it's enough to do a network diagram. And here's the network they made. And remember what you've just seen. Okay, you can have faunal turnovers, but mass extinctions look different. So right now, that's the Avalonian. That's the most ancient from 575 to 560. There's the White Sea in yellow. There's the Nama in red. And the blue is sort of shared fauna that's found in more than one group. And the conclusion that we come to from this analysis is that's the earliest recorded mass extinction in Earth history at 560 million years. That had not been recognized before. That was not seen, but you see it so clearly here. You see that change in fauna. It's not a facies change. That's a fundamental change in the organisms that lived. So this is the kind of discovery, I think, that can be made. And the more data we have going deep in Earth history, the more that we can find. I mentioned how you have hidden axes. Here's that beautiful carbon bipartite network with localities in black and carbon minerals in red. And in this case, they are colored by the earliest occurrence of each of those minerals. Do you see a spectrum through this? By golly, if there isn't a time axis there. Now, what is this telling us? It may just tell us that the commonest minerals are the ones that are most likely to find in old rocks. That's also, by the way, an axis of mineral hardness. The oldest rocks here also tend to be averaged harder than others. It's also an axis of increasing structural complexity. If you look at the crystal structures and you basically interpret them in terms of the number of bits of information, the very simple minerals tend to be the older ones, and more complex minerals are these ones on the outside. There's so much information embedded in this diagram, we have just begun to scratch the surface of what it means. I've got to tell you one more story, because this, in some ways, may be the most transformative, and it may be the one where network analysis leads us to a discovery we simply couldn't make any other way. And that has to do with the evolution of proteins. Now, if you look in Earth's history, we know that there have been a whole variety of proteins that transfer electrons. They're called oxidoreductases. They're in our bodies. They do all kinds of metabolic functions. Anytime you need to oxidize or reduce something, for example, if you want to break glucose down into smaller molecules, you're basically oxidizing. It's like burning. And so these oxidation reactions are going on in your body. The respiration, glycolysis, all of these use oxidoreductases. And there are many, many examples in biology that do this. Every one of these oxidoreductases has a small group of atoms at its core that includes a transition metal, an iron or a copper or a manganese, cobalt, vanadium, one of these elements that can transfer electrons. That's the active site. That's where all the information goes. But surrounding it is this very, very complex web of amino acids in a chain. That's what the protein is. And as we understand it, those amino acids which bond to the active site sort of twist and pull and distort it so that the energy of the electron transfer is an exact value to trigger a particular chemical reaction in your body. Not 1/100 of a volt higher, not 1/100 of a volt lower, exactly what you need. So there's been an evolutionary process which we think may point to the fact that early metabolism was done just by minerals, and that life figured out ways to make the minerals more efficient, make the catalysis more efficient. So that's the idea. The other thing you need to know, and that's this blue-green diagram, is that the composition of Earth's oceans has changed systematically through time. In the most ancient oceans, we think the most abundant element was iron, because iron in its reduced form is soluble in water. Today, iron is not abundant in the oceans because it's more oxidized, and the oxidized form forms red minerals, rust, that just fall out to the bottom and create iron oxides on the ocean floor. If you go a little bit more, manganese becomes more abundant later on in the ocean's history, and copper is an element that becomes abundant only recently, and this is the weird scale, so the copper today, which is over here, actually is someplace above iron here. It's just remember iron, manganese, copper. Remember that, iron, manganese, copper. And you can analyze protein structures in a variety of ways. You can look at when you think proteins first came into existence in Earth history. Here's 4.5 billion years. And there's different kinds of proteins up there. And very primitive ones use iron. A little bit later they use manganese, and most recently they use copper. That's something that's been found. You can show this yet another way. You can analyze the similarities and differences of the sequences that make these proteins. And you can do what are called phylogenetic trees. And again, the most deeply rooted, the most ancient proteins appear to be ones that focus with iron. More recent ones have more manganese, and then very recently I mean maybe 2 or 3 billion years ago, copper comes into the picture. Okay, why am I telling you this? Because Jana Bromberg has done an astonishing network diagram of protein structures. And this is really an abstract idea here, because you have nodes, each one represents a protein structure. And 2 nodes are close together. If the protein structures, the part just right around that metal end that is the active site, if they're very similar in shape, like 2 fists, those nodes are going to be close together. If they're very different in shape, the nodes are far apart. And you draw a link from one node to another only if those 2 proteins have the exact same function in biology. That is, they accomplish the same chemical trick. So remember, nodes are close together if the structures are similar, far apart if the structures are different. The links then represent something very different, the similarity in function. That's the only thing that went into making this network. The only thing that goes into it is just structure and function. There's no information about age because we can't date protein. You can't look at a protein and say, oh, that's a 4 billion year old protein. But remember, this is a network which shows similarities and differences. After she does the network, she says, okay, let's color all of these nodes according to the most abundant metal that occurs in that protein. And I know you've already got the punchline. I know you can see this because you have iron-bearing proteins at one end, manganese in the middle, copper at the end. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that's a time axis. We have been struggling for years to understand the evolution of proteins. We want to understand how proteins evolved in parallel with Earth's geochemistry, with the changing chemistry of the oceans. Because the ocean chemistry is going to dictate what metals are available to make proteins. What we are seeing here is a geochemical timeline of Earth history. And it's embedded entirely in protein structures and functions. How can that be? Well, that's what network diagrams do. It embeds information you wouldn't otherwise have. So, if you can imagine now that this is 6,000 proteins, so the actual data is in much, much, much higher dimensions you can just extract the iron and you can look at subsets. And there are all these little vectors through it running timelines for what are called hemes, timelines what are called ferrodoxins, timelines for nitrogenase enzymes, all these different, there's an incredible amount of information about the evolution of proteins in here and how that evolution is co-aligned with Earth's geochemical environment. This is going to be a lifetime of work for people. It's all because network analysis embeds information that you simply don't include when you make the network. That's the power of networks. Wow, I mean, I hope you see, as I showed last night, that there's these large and growing data resources. They allow us to do things and see the world, see the evolution, the co-evolution of the geosphere and biosphere in ways we simply couldn't have done before. I've given you some examples. They're just examples of an almost infinite number of ways that we can apply data-driven discovery to understand our planet in more and greater detail. So with that, I'll ask you once again, please visit our website, dtdi.carnegiescience.edu. You can explore these networks, see how they work, learn more about making them if you're interested, maybe make some of your own. I want to once again thank my colleagues, the many, many colleagues who have helped us in this endeavor, the funding agencies, and again, as last night, I really look forward to the chance to share with you some thoughts and maybe some questions. So thank you very much.
To the extent that these things can represent time, is there any potential for them to be predictive?
So the question was, is there any potential for these to be predictive? And that echoes the question that was asked last night about, can we extend some of these backwards in time? So when you have sparse data, can we say what might have occurred even earlier in time? And I think both those are absolutely true. We haven't really, I've talked to my data science colleagues about this. They say, well, you got to be a little bit careful, you know, we don't really like extrapolating in each end, but on the other hand, they say, yeah, but maybe you could do some stuff. So we haven't really looked at that. I think that it's a very, very exciting direction to go, because after all, we do live on an evolving planet, and the past maybe give us some hints about the future. Yes?
So for the carbon, how does biology play into that shape?
So that's a great question, and we could in fact color the nodes according to the extent to which they are biominerals, or they are biologically mediated minerals, or so forth. We haven't done that, and we really should. One of the things we could do is just color the ones that are the result of oxygenation, you know, the weathering. And what I talked about last night is about 2/3 of all the mineral species arose simply because Earth had an oxygen-rich atmosphere about 2.5 billion years ago, and that led to just weathering and alteration of all sorts of minerals that occurred before then. So we could show in that diagram through colors which ones are which, and we should do that. We haven't done that. Eventually, we want to be able to have all the data that's associated with this and just have a whole series of toggles where you can just verniers where you can change characteristics, or you can flip from one visualization to another. So that's a great idea to do.
But why don't you have the sulfur P-gas going up opposite the oxygen P-gas?
Say again?
In the copper diagram?
Yes.
Why didn't you have the sulfur P-gas going vertically? You had it going
that's schematic, and it may be that there's different axes in there, because I sort of went to the join between the sulfates and but certainly as you get to that edge, the top and the right-hand side, you're getting farther and farther away from the oxygen-rich portion of the spectrum. So, and again, as being a two-dimensional projection, we should look at this in 3 dimensions, we should look at this in higher dimensions, and there'll be more information embedded as we do that.
So it's interesting that a lot of these diagrams are aesthetically pleasing. Why is that?
That is an incredible question. Is why are some of these diagrams so aesthetically pleasing? We are not programming them to be aesthetically pleasing, and very often network diagrams aren't. They look like balls of they're called hairballs. You know, they're just this horrible mass of things. They don't have obvious symmetries. The nodes will be spread out in kinds of random clumps. these diagrams often seem to have much more symmetry. Now, we have to still understand this, but I think what it means is that some of the mathematical relationships amongst the distribution and distribution and diversity of minerals are very deeply embedded in the way our planet works. And you see the same kinds of relationships in biological ecosystems, and we think we're going to see some of the same relationships in paleobiology relationships, but we haven't explored those nearly as much. But I think that's a very profound question. The symmetries that just arise are not things we expected.
So when you look for these patterns, are you having people look for them, or are you using artificial intelligence or computers to find?
On all these diagrams, we use cluster analysis, which if you're in the workshops today, we talked about a lot, but there's different kinds of clustering algorithms. There's different principal component analyses. We basically look at the relationships in higher dimensions of all the different parameters that go into the network. So you can characterize networks. There are books on network theory. I mentioned last night there are books on lexical statistics, which are funded by the NSA. The books on network theory are also funded by the NSA because they're trying to understand social networks to track down people and so forth. And the mathematics is just astonishing, and it's higher dimension. Something like this would be analyzed, in 400-dimensional space, and I get to the third page of these books and just say to my applied math people, go ahead, go with it. But there are metrics that you can apply to all these networks, and they basically will tell you what makes this network distinct from. Is that getting too annoying, by the way? Because you start off with everything in a little cluster, and then it finds this is the force-directed network finding its equilibrium state. But it's a little frenetic at times. Okay, so, yeah, thanks. That's a great question.
Does this have a relationship to fractals and the like, where you have an equation and then it self-organizes to some form and then you change something in the equation?
So the question is about fractals. When I think about fractals, and I'm not a mathematical expert on fractals, but what I understand is fractals imply self-similarity. And we haven't seen self-similarity in our particular networks. You do see them in sun networks, where you have sort of a central array, and then it leads to other central array, and then leads to other arrays, and just keeps going out. That would be what I would think of as a kind of fractal behavior. This is a much more discrete kind of symmetrical object. And there's not subsets within this network that have the same U shape or bowl shape or whatever it really is. But I think that mathematical exploration in a larger sense, to find mathematical relationships that describe geometrically what's going on here is very important. One of the ways we want to do that is to create synthetic data sets. And that means basically you have object A through, triple Z, and you just basically design different ways of interacting those data, and you create networks that are abstract to see what parameters lead to the U shape and at what point you diverge from that and have some other symmetry. So that's called synthetic data. We haven't had time to explore that yet, but I know that our applied mathematicians and data scientists want to do that because this for them is really exciting discovery science. It pushes the field of network analysis in a new direction.
The diagrams or your displays have shown through the arrow of time there's greater complexification in the minerals. Also, we know that through time there's a greater complexification with each extinction event, with each new what new species takes over, whether it's simple like to aquatic life, land life, mammalian, and so forth. Is there a correlation, or is there even looking at what is the correlation between the complexification of minerals, the evolution of minerals, and the complexification of life on Earth?
So this question of how complexification increases through time is a really important one, and we have to be very careful. So I've been working with Sergei Kravovichev, who's a Russian mineralogist and expert in complexity of atomic structures. And we did a paper recently where we observed this increase in complexity through time, very, very dramatic. but that increase in complexity exactly correlates with an increase in chemical composition complexity. So I mentioned last night there were these dozen or so minerals. They average only about 2 elements per mineral. If you go to the chondrite meteorites, which is the next stage, they average about 3 elements per mineral. If you go to the earliest, the Hadean stage, where I said there were 420 minerals, they average about 4.5 elements per mineral. And if you look at the modern time, the average is more like 5.8. I think that's the current average for all minerals on Earth today. And it turns out that increase in chemical complexity by itself can explain the increase in structural complexity. So then you have to say, well, why would Earth become chemically more complex? And I think that has to do exactly with what we worry about when we think about the evolution of ore deposits, that it takes time for Earth to, with fluid rock interactions and other processes, to select and concentrate those elements and make them sufficiently concentrated that you have a local environment that can produce a new mineral. And the new minerals we see today tend to be chemically much more complex, but that's something that probably was not a characteristic of earliest Earth because Earth had not had the time. It does lead to a question, does the universe spontaneously become more complex? I also think we have to be very, very careful about saying that, we're more complex than the dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs are more complex than the fish. When you think about the complexity, most biologists would say it really is at the cellular level, and once eukaryotes developed, and there's far more complexity in the metabolic variety of single-cell organisms there is in all the eukaryotes, which in the phylogenetic branch are just this little cluster at one part of the diagram. But again, this is a debate that can go on. What do we mean by complexity of a system? How do you measure it? Turns out you can measure bits of information in a crystal structure much better than you can measure the bits of information in a nervous system of different animals. In the back.
Concerning the Ediacaran example, I'm wondering how confident you'd be that that's a distinction, just as it appears like one that you've seen in other times when we have more fossils. At that time, could it be multiple origins, multicellular life? Could it be very sparse preservation, a lot of genetic drift and isolated peripherals? Could it be, something else like that?
Great. So there's this question about the Ediacaran extinction. Mike Meyer is ready to publish. He's eager to just jump all over. He thinks this is great. Drew Macenti is not so sure. Andy Noel is agnostic about it right now. So this is a vigorous debate. Both of them agree to call it a faunal turnover. So a faunal turnover can be any one of a number of things. It can represent the fact that you're going from shallow water to deep water or vice versa. It can be that there's some climate change, or that you're collecting fossils from just a different part of the world where things were different, or it could be a mass extinction. And I think that right now maybe that's the more conservative view. I think it's really cool to think that we can tease out a mass extinction at 560, but you're absolutely right. We have to be cautious, and it has not been published yet for that reason. Wow, this is you got another question?
I'm kind of groping for a predictive question along the lines of what Lou asked. You can look at these axes and groupings and intuit out time or chemistry or all these various things. Will these ever show you there should be something there, but it's not there, and so what's missing? Can you ever break that out or something like this?
So a corollary of network analysis is what I talked about last night, affinity analysis, or this market basket analysis. That again is looking for relations between things that coexist and things that do not coexist. So indeed, embedded in the networks are the exact same information we would use if we wanted to predict a new mineral at a particular locality or a new ore deposit. The characteristics, all these characteristics obtain in some particular locality, but we have another locality that has some of the same characteristics that hasn't been examined. Let's go there because we might be able to find the next large ore deposit, or might be able to find some rare minerals or something like that. So certainly that information is embedded. We have not yet applied network analysis metrics to that particular problem. And that is a very important future direction. Yeah. networks have to lead to some kind of discovery science in order to be at all useful, other than just a pedagogic tool. And these are amazing pedagogic tools, by the way. You can imagine students exploring and learning about different mineral or fossil origin systems in this way. And people who are on Facebook, they just get this right away. Networks are very intuitively obvious in that sense. Please.
So this is the carbon. Where's diamond in there? I'm trying to...
Yeah, a diamond is, if I'm remembering correctly, it is one of these blue dots. When it settles down, I think it's that one right there. And I was interested in that because it is, it's certainly, I have to take that back because it would have to be a red one. It has to be a red node. It's a small red node someplace in that general region. I did look it up, but it doesn't particularly stand out. Diamond's relatively common. It's known at about 700 localities. It occurs in all parts of the globe. It occurs in very ancient rocks, but in some more recent ones. So it's as a mineral, it doesn't stand out in the carbon network in the way you might think it does.
So I was wondering, because earlier you were saying, an age line there, so clearly you have old diamonds, but also younger ones.
Yeah.
And one or two deposit types, so like how do those different things, you have different minerals that have different ages or different...
Yeah, so the timeline isn't exact. There are minerals that occurred in more ancient times that maybe are not as quite as many localities, and there's some minerals that are quite rare, but may still occur in very ancient rocks. So there's not a one-to-one correlation, and again, this is a projection from higher dimensions. So those are the details, and as soon as you see those details, you're going to say, well, what's special about that node? What's special about that node? And so then you explore exactly those ideas.
So I was really wondering, have you done any deeper mineralogy?
Oh, I'm supposed to do that. That's in one of my grants, I promised to do that. And I haven't yet, so you're making me feel guilty by asking. So yeah, so we're supposed to look at deep earth carbon mineral evolution indeed. And that's going to be an interesting process. My suspicion is that when you go deeper and deeper, because the temperatures are very high, that you have equilibration, you have fewer different exotic minerals. You're not going to have what are called metastable. You're not going to have a lot of exotic conditions. The temperatures will tend to form, very quickly the stable phases, and you'll have a lot more element mobility, and so you're not going to have all these little pockets of anomaly, diversity, and so forth. So that's my guess, but we haven't really explored that as much as we need to.
I don't see any of your colleagues here. Please thank them for us.
I think they're all exhausted. They stayed up much of the night working on the presentations for this morning. So they've been great, and I will pass on that thanks to you. Yeah. And I'm going to go find them and see where they're having. I think they're at a bar someplace. So.
This time, Dr. Hazen.